Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology. Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology. Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology.
Yeah, of course.
Not when you're getting my job.
You can ask to help me. There you go. Does that feel secure? Brilliant. So if you're good. All good? Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming back after lunch. So we're going to kick off our first afternoon session with Suzanne, and she's going to be telling us about using Padlet and Snapchat to encourage engagement with core teaching materials out with the classroom. Suzanne.
Thank you. Can I just check you can hear me yet? If I stand behind here, you won't see me, so I'm going to move out to the side. So I'm a teaching fellow at Strathclyde University. I teach prosthetics and orthotics, but my interest in using social media has expanded over the last few years, and I use Snapchat as a tutorial tool with my students. So I'll go through the forecast of why use social media with your students in higher education. I'm sure most of you in the room will be familiar with what Padlet is, but perhaps maybe not with how you might be able to use Snapchat in higher education. I'll also talk about how I integrated Padlet within my Snapchat tutorials as well. And I'll talk a bit about the student feedback, the feedback I've got from students about using these, and a brief bit about GDPR. So I particularly like this quote here, and this is why I started using social media with my students. I wanted to bridge that gap between formal learning in the classroom and informal learning out with the class. Our students have a very full timetable. They're in 9 till 5 pretty much every day, apart from a Wednesday afternoon. So there's limited opportunity for students to come and speak to me. So I wanted to be able to give them opportunity to communicate with me out with these classroom settings. If you are considering using social media in higher education, you need to think about where your students are. If I decided to start using Twitter with my second year group, hardly any of them are on Twitter, so that would be a pointless thing. So I said to them, where are you? Where do you want to communicate with me? And this came about because I tried to set up a forum on the University VLE. The students weren't engaging with that because it took 2, 3, 4 clicks to access the forum, and that was just too much. They weren't prepared to do that. And I asked them where they are, and Snapchat was the answer, and that's why I started using Snapchat as a tutorial tool. Don't be afraid to ask your students for help. The students were very much instrumental in setting this up with me. I'll talk a bit more later about managing expectations of using social media with your students. And it's important that we model good behaviour when we're utilising social media, and the students can reflect that as well. And ultimately, be brave, just give it a try. So I'll just show you this, the Padlet that I created for the students. So I'm aware that there'll be a few of you who don't know what Padlet is, but I like to describe it as an electronic whiteboard. In our course in prosthetics and orthotics, the students have to do a lot of practical patient assessment techniques, and when we demonstrate these, the students are busy taking notes. They're not watching the demonstration. When it comes to the practical sessions, they struggle. So this year I said to them, how about I take some short videos of each of these patient assessment techniques, I'll pop them on a Padlet, and I'll integrate that and share it with you on Snapchat. So all of the videos you can see here, typically less than a minute long. Each of the videos has got the specific name of the clinical test, and there's a short video describing how that's done. So essentially what this meant was the students were able to, first of all, concentrate in the demonstration. They weren't busy taking notes. Secondly, it meant they had a resource that they could access out with the classroom setting. They could look at these patient assessment videos on the bus on the way home. If they're sitting on the couch of an evening, that information was available to them as and when they wanted to use it. If you're using Padlets, I would recommend that you make it secret or password protected. And one of the good things about Padlet is that there's no sign-up required by the students. I can either send the students a link to the Padlet, or what I did was I integrated it within Snapchat tutorials. And the module evaluations at the end were very positive. The students really appreciated having this resource, and I would say, out of the comments, it was, what did you most like about this course? The access to the videos featured very highly in that. So you're probably familiar with Snapchat, using Snapchat to make yourself look 10 years younger or perhaps like a rabbit. I particularly liked this one here because the filter matched my top. That's exciting. So essentially it is a camera app, and that's what primarily people know it's used for pictures. This may or may not be lost on you. Snapchat has got a bit of a bad reputation for being used inappropriately, with people sending parts of their body, images of parts of their body that they shouldn't to other people. So it's got a bit of a bad reputation. We need to try and get over that. And that's because typically using Snapchat, the app, the pictures disappear after 10 seconds. And that's one of the misconceptions that I have to deal with when I'm using Snapchat, is that it can be used in different ways. Bitmojis, for me, are an essential part of using Snapchat as a tutorial tool. With your Bitmoji, it's essentially you're creating an avatar. It can come down to the shape of your face, colour of your eyes, your hairstyle. This is my colleague Sean, and I think he's got the world's best Bitmoji. Sometimes people say to me, why do you use Snapchat? Why don't you just use WhatsApp? And the problem with WhatsApp for me is that in order to be in a group with someone in WhatsApp, you need to provide them with your mobile phone number. As much as I love my students, I don't want them to have my mobile phone number. Okay? With Snapchat, the students join your group with a Snap code, and I'll show you what that looks like a bit later. So why do I use Snapchat? I've told you previously, it's because that's where my students are. That's where they wanted me to communicate with them. And interestingly as well, 77% of those between the age of 18 and 24 are Snapchat users. So it's a large demographic of our student population are Snapchat users. And essentially, the students weren't engaging in the University VLE forums, so I wanted to find out how I could communicate with them more effectively. When the students helped me create my Bitmoji, and they said, oh, you want to be on ghost mode. I had no idea what they were talking about. When you use Snapchat, so these are my students, so it can tell you where you are with alarming accuracy down to the street that you live in. And this was created so that when students or people are having a night out, they can find out where their friends are and go and meet them. But you can see me here, I'm in ghost mode, so the only person that can see me on the Snap map is me. And that's me travelling to Alt last year in Manchester. So the heat maps indicate where there's a high activity of Snapchat users. So you can be on ghost mode. That's something to be aware of. So this is Deb Bath. When we travelled to Alt last year, I did a Snapchat tutorial with some of the Alt committee members. So Deb thought that was hilarious. I could show that she was on a train, and we used that to find each other. So remember I said to you, you don't need your mobile phone number to connect with each other. You can use the Snap code. This is the Snap code here. You can actually just have it up on the screen as you're presenting to the students. They can take a picture of it, and they would then add you to Snapchat. So this was the Snapchat tutorial I did on the way down to Alt last year. And one of the things I quite like about Snapchat is you can see who's there. The little Bitmojis pop up, and you can see who's participating. And one of the things that I particularly like about Snapchat is you can have students who participate silently in the background, so silent participation. but it means they don't miss out. You might have students who are asking you lots of questions, but everyone benefits from the answers to that. So with Snapchat, how do I use it? It is optional, it's not compulsory, so students engage with this if they want to. And I use the chat function, which means messages can actually be saved. Typically, messages are deleted after 5 or 10 seconds. If you're using the chat function, you press on the message, and it can be retained indefinitely. I ask questions, and the students will respond to that. Sometimes the student asks questions. And one thing that's particularly good is that the students can answer each other's questions, and I can moderate that. And if they've got something a bit wrong, then I can jump in and clarify any issues that they're having with that. This is just an indication of one of the chats that we had. We talked about how to identify the talonavicular joint. So I was able to pop up an image of the foot and identify exactly where the talonavicular joint is. But the students find this a very positive experience. They find it's easier to communicate because it's less formal. It's a more relaxed way of asking questions. And importantly, they can see when I'm available. So I wasn't really aware that what I was doing was particularly innovative until Eric Stoller basically used this as an example of one of his presentations at the Open University. This was the first Snapchat message that I sent out to my students. It was an X-ray, so I was doing spinal orthotics with them. I was able to zoom in on a particular aspect of the X-ray and draw their attention to that. This was on a Saturday evening. I just tried it, sent out a message, and within 10 minutes I had like 10, 15 responses from students. And they engaged because they wanted to. And that's the magic of it as well. Students can communicate with you if they're in the pub, if they're sitting on the sofa. So there are pros and cons to using Snapchat. The pros are that you can communicate with lots of students at the one time. Typically, students would email me a question, and that one student would get the answer. With Snapchat, one student emails me, and the whole group can get engages with that material. And it facilitates learning on the go, as I've said. The cons are the group size. It's limited to 32 people. So if you've got a very large cohort, then it's not going to be appropriate, but perhaps you could use it in your tutorial groups. I said I would talk about managing expectations. The students can see when I'm on Snapchat. I go on to Snapchat when I want to be there, and I pop up and they know that I'm there. They can ask me questions. And as I said, I do communicate with them out with working hours because our timetable is so full. But if that's not what you'd like to do, you can manage that and say, I'll be available between office hours. So you have to manage the expectations of the students. Another downside, potentially, is the increased use of social media. We know about the problems that can cause. And obviously, there's an investment of time that's required as well to manage these things. So if I'm starting a tutorial on Snapchat, I'll let the students know, are you ready? And when I've had enough, I'll tell them I'm logging off or good night. If they're not particularly engaging, I can send out, where are you? But it rarely happens because the students are very good at engaging with the tutorials. It's good for motivating before the exams. I'll send them good luck messages out on Snapchat. And they communicate with me using Bitmojis as well. So these are just 10, there's a blog post that I've written about 10 reasons to use Snapchat as a tutorial tool with your students. The students particularly like it, as I said, due to the ease of communication, the rapidity of that communication as well, and it was a less formal way to communicate. So what I said previously about being able to save the messages, when a message is sent on Snapchat, there's a fine line that appears. If you press on the message, it becomes a thick line, and that's how you know that your message has been saved within that. So yeah, what about GDPR? So Snapchat and Padlet are both GDPR compliant, and that's something that we do need to be aware of, and also to be aware of the fact that not all of our students want to use social media tools. And also not to assume that our students all know how these tools work. I had one student who was she was quite angry, actually, that I was using Snapchat as a tutorial tool within a university setting, and she sent me quite an extensive, long email telling me why I shouldn't be doing that. But part of the reason was she misunderstood the tool. She said, what's the point of communicating in this way? The message disappears after 5 or 10 seconds. So we shouldn't assume that students know how these tools work. So I was able to explain to her that you actually can save the messages. Also, there are students who don't want to engage with Snapchat, and what I did do was I was transferring relevant teaching material onto the university VLE, so the students didn't miss out on that opportunity as well. So I've got a few blog posts about how and why I was using Snapchat as a tutorial tool. There's also a YouTube video that you might find quite useful, and there's also some student testimonials at the end of that video as well. And Alex Spears couldn't be with us today, but along with the Social Media and Higher Education Committee, I'd like to invite you all to SOCMED HE, which is taking place in Edge Hill University on the 19th of December. So thank you very much for your time, and I'd happily accept any questions. Thanks.
About your choice of the use of Padlet. So they're asking whether you reconsidered it when it wasn't free anymore, and why Padlet, not a VLE.
So when it wasn't free anymore, I personally paid the license for it. So yeah, I took that choice because I felt it was very useful. You get 5 free Padlets. I could just reuse one of my old Padlets and do the same thing. But I think the way I particularly liked about Padlet is that all those patient assessment videos are in the one place where the students can access them very easily, rather than having them as a series of videos perhaps stacked on the university VLE.
Brilliant, thanks. And the guys online would also like to know a bit more about sort of the student view of Snapchat, so whether anyone didn't want to take part, and whether anyone got disadvantaged for not taking part, and whether they found it easier than traditional tools.
Very much so. The feedback was that they found it easier to communicate with me because it was a less formal environment. As I said, it was optional, and I was aware of the fact that students were missing out on this communication. So all of the students are on a Facebook group. And what I did do originally was I screenshotted the relevant teaching material, because there is a bit of chat that was on as well. And then I would then post that on the university VLE, but that took me 12 steps to get there as well. So that wasn't really a long-term solution. So the students have agreed that if there's anything, I'll ask them to take a screenshot of it and share it on their class Facebook group, and they're happy to do that, and everyone's on that Facebook group, so nobody misses out. Yep.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any questions in here?
Escape.
Yes, gentleman in pink.
I know sometimes when these things are considered, one of the objections is that it'll raise expectations among students that every lecturer will do this and create pressure or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, have you encountered that? And if so, how have you responded to it?
Well, generally the people that I work with roll their eyes when I'm using Snapchat as a tutorial tool and go, what are you doing now? But they're the first people to come to me and say, oh, can you put a message out on Snapchat to the students, because they know that the students will read this. And I guess it's about managing expectations. The other members of staff aren't willing to do this, but I've had very positive feedback from the students myself. And you can't force other people to engage with social media and higher education. All you can do is perhaps lead by example, show the benefits to the students, and hope that they might bring them along with you.
Hi, just a question on the support. Now, if the students don't know how to use Snapchat, are you the one that's actually telling them how to do it, or is IT aware that you're using it?
The university are aware that I'm using it. I was invited to present at the University Learning and Teaching Conference by the Vice Dean Principal of the university, so the university are aware that I'm using it. Our year group sizes are quite small. The maximum class size is about between, depending on year group, 37, 45 students. So yes, I can help them, but it's more likely that their colleagues round about them will help them with that.
How much extra work is this for you? Because it seems you put it in 3 different places.
Well, I don't. I just put it in one place, and if I want the students to, I'll ask them to screenshot something, and then they'll put it on their chat, on their Facebook group. And it is a bit of extra work, but it's valuable work. I really appreciate the interactions that I'm having with the students, and we've seen the positive benefit of using the patient assessment videos. The students are much more proficient when they come into patient assessment sessions, and it's a valuable resource that they've got to go over as well. So yes, there's more work, but it's valuable work that I appreciate, and the students seem to appreciate it too.
I love it.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Okay, so next we are mapping the field of digital identity and wellbeing with, are you Julie or?
Julianne.
Julianne, perfect.
Yes, Julianne's fine. Okay, thank you. I'll take these off. Right, good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about mapping the territory of digital wellbeing education. And this is work that Chrissa Themelis and I have been carrying out as part of a European-funded research project funded under the Erasmus Plus programme. First of all, I'm going to start by putting a question out there for you to think about while I'm giving this presentation. Google has recently produced some digital well-being tips and tools, and it's advice and apps that you can use on your phone to monitor your digital usage, monitor how long you're spending on your phone, what apps you're using. So it's providing you with feedback so that you can take responsibility for your own digital well-being. Mozilla have also got some web pages, and their internet health discusses issues such as information security and digital inclusion and openness, and of course privacy and security, which is very important. So who is responsible for our digital well-being? Is it ourselves? Is it just ourselves? Or is it technology companies? Is it institutions like higher education institutions? Is it governments? GDPR, of course, has, is the government's help for digital security. But how much is it our responsibility? So that's what I want you to think about. So the Digital Wellbeing Educators Project has the intention to build the capacity of teaching staff in higher education institutions to deliver digital education and promote the digital well-being of students. The first element of this research project that I'm going to talk about here is the mapping of the territory of digital well-being education, and we've done that through looking at the educational literature and the practice that is going on in higher education institutions. We do focus just on higher education institutions. I know there's a lot of work that has gone on in schools, especially secondary schools, but we're taking the focus purely on higher education at the moment. We have also carried out interviews with staff who have delivered digital well-being interventions. They may be researchers, they may be practitioners, they may be both. And we've analysed those 10 interviews and looked at the challenges, risks, and opportunities that came out of the analysis. So that's what I'll talk to you about. That's what I'll focus on today. We do have a report which includes the full literature review, and it's got case studies of digital wellbeing interventions that have been carried out in higher education. We don't just focus on higher education in the UK because it is funded by the European Commission, and we have an international collaboration which involves partners from Ireland, Spain, and Denmark. So we do take an international focus. The definition of digital well-being that we have used is taken from the GIST Digital Capability Framework, and you can see that there. The blue line, which encompasses everything, is digital identity and digital well-being. The definition, I won't read it all out because I'll just pick out some of the relevant points. The definition covers personal health, safety, relationships, and work-life balance. The idea of balance between the digital world and your real world is quite important there, and issues of workload, overload, and distraction. They're personal features, but they also look at how you negotiate and resolve conflict with others. So there's also this community aspect to the notion of digital well-being. So that's more than the definition that seems to be behind Google's tips and tools. So we interviewed 10 people, we analysed the data, we've looked at the literature, and we've looked at the practice that's going on currently in higher education institutions in Europe. And we came up with several themes. I'm only picking out some of the main themes. There's an awful lot more that's in the report. But the main themes that came out in terms of challenges for digital well-being research was that there's a lack of studies that evaluate changes in habits, beliefs, and attitudes. It's not that there's a lack of studies. There are studies that evaluate the impact of digital interventions, but they tend to focus on knowledge acquisition. You know, the educational goal. Have you managed to teach something about digital well-being? So that may have improved people's understanding and awareness of digital well-being, but has it actually had an effect on their beliefs, their attitudes, and most importantly, their behaviors and their habits? Secondly, it's a multidisciplinary field, so that can be a challenge. It covers psychology, philosophy, sociology, education, and it's not always very easy for one individual to access all those fields. And thirdly, the lack of an agreed definition on what is digital well-being. Google has a focus that it's mainly about personal responsibility, it's about the distractibility, whereas the GIST definition broadens that out, and it's not just your relationship with the technology, it's also about your relationship with other people through the technology. So that involves the community. However, at the University of Milan, they have a digital well-being center, and Gui and colleagues there are sociologists, and their definition of digital well-being has a much stronger emphasis on the effect that society and the norms and practices within a community or a society have on your own digital well-being and on how you manage your digital well-being. To give an example of that, you might have normal practices that are there for your learning community. You might have a code of conduct of what's expected of people while they're using a learning environment. So while I'm talking about this, I mean, a lot of it is relevant to any kind of use of digital tools, but I'm mainly focusing on how it's used in an educational setting. Okay, secondly, the risks. I've mentioned some of the risks already about attention and distraction. There's a lot of talk in the media about how mobile phones are bad in schools because they're distracting the kids from the learning. You know, there's always tales of the distraction of students sitting in lecture theatres who are not focusing perhaps on the speaker, but are on social media. So there's a lot of scaremongering. about distraction and addiction. In fact, what we found were that addiction is not really addiction, if you know what I mean. You don't, but anyway. There was a paper published earlier this year by Orden and his colleagues, which said that, smartphone addiction is a myth. It's not there. It's not really addiction. So the distractibility and the addiction affect you personally, and of course that might lead to stress, lack of sleep, and a sedentary lifestyle. These things are mentioned in the media frequently. In terms of a community setting, you see things like cyberbullying and cybersecurity, and of course fake news, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal last year, where data was stolen from Facebook, is of course also in the media. And these can have an effect on our democracy, on our human rights, and the targeting of particular social groups or particular people through the use of big data can have effects on society. For example, selling makeup to depressed teenagers. There's advertising that targets teenagers who've said that they're depressed on social media. And yes, they do buy more makeup. So the makeup companies are targeting them. Is that ethical? I'm not sure. So, opportunities. A lot of what I've said about the challenges and risks have been critical of digital media, of digital tools, but the participants that we interviewed also commented how there were opportunities that they could see. They could see the value of digital tools. The extended mind thesis is a theory that's well known in philosophy and psychology, and it says that the mind is extended by the use of digital tools. So the use of the technology becomes an integral part of our thinking and reasoning processes. Google searches are a normal part of the way that we think nowadays. It may not be a Google search, but it may be checking Wikipedia. So these have become normal, and they have a value in extending what we can do and how we reason and think. Secondly, personalized education was identified as a potential value. Maybe not quite there at the moment, but there's great potential for recommender systems and personalized education. For example, if you took Apple's Siri personal assistant and transferred that to an educational setting, you would have, a personal tutor. Thirdly, avatars in virtual environments have great potential. Well, actually, they're already being used for treatments for phobias, for changing people's attitudes, which is interesting. People do use them to explore issues of identity. And finally, I will conclude by saying that we should engage in the public debate over who is responsible for digital media. It's not a simple answer to the question of who's responsible. To a certain extent, it is a personal responsibility. It is the digital technology companies who are responsible. Government can play a role, and so can higher education institutions. We do need more research into ethics, to critical digital pedagogy, which we heard about this morning in the keynote, And we need more impact studies that actually look at whether or not they're effective in changing people's attitudes and behaviours. So it could be a moral obligation, really, on us to, as educators, as technologists, and in higher education institutions, to promote the digital well-being of not just our staff, who we're responsible for, but also the students that we're responsible for. Critical pedagogy suggests that if students live in a culture that digitizes and educates them through a screen, then they require an education that empowers them in that sphere, that teaches them that language and that offers them new opportunities of human connectivity in online learning environments. Okay. I'll just finally say the project is currently developing a professional development course for educators in higher education, a teacher's pack with resources, and a couple of apps for students and educators to help improve their digital well-being and digital literacy skills. If you are interested in those, they will be released in April. So you can, and there will be public showcase events in these locations. And you can connect to us through LinkedIn group, through Facebook, or through the project website that's there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one of the really interesting questions that we've had on VVox is whether you think digital well-being needs to be singled out as a specific problem, or whether it sort of comes more under a general well-being topic now.
I think that general well-being is important to educate people about general well-being, but I think as higher education educators, if we're encouraging people to use digital environments, then we need to make sure that they're equipped to work in those arenas.
Brilliant, thank you. Has anyone got any questions in here? Somebody on the VVox is concerned whether we are creating students who can only interact digitally.
Well, I don't know about that. I teach on distance learning programs, so I would be guilty of teaching students to interact only digitally, but that's not all the students that are in higher education. So I hope we're not teaching them all to only be able to interact digitally, but I think we have to be realistic. The digital technology is here to stay. We need to use it in the best way, and we need to teach people how to be safe and use it responsibly.
For sure, and I think one of the points at the very start of your presentation was about sort of the balance between working as well, and I think that comes into that as well, as encouraging people to have a good balance between online and offline.
Absolutely, and I think that's important for the staff as well as for the students. We have a responsibility to the students, but institutions also have a responsibility to the staff who are being ever increasingly encouraged to do things digitally.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
And for our final slot this afternoon, Kelly is here to talk to us about EdShare Hub.
Thank you very much. So I'm from the Computer Science School at the University of Southampton, where I'm part of an enterprise team that runs within our Web and Internet Science Research Group. And what I'd like to do today is share some information with you about our solution EdShare, that was created at Southampton, but more specifically about some of the recent work we've been doing around the creation of an aggregation service layer to aid the discoverability of open educational resources. So if you haven't heard of EdShare before, it's a digital content platform that's built on the open source software ePrints, which is also created at Southampton, and it's been optimized for sharing teaching and learning materials. And many of you may have heard of ePrints already. There's a lot of institutions, particularly across the UK, but also across the world, that are using it to support open access. But EdShare has been heavily influenced by the design and ethos of the Web 2.0 media sharing sites. And it's part of a suite of products that we have available through our enterprise team at Southampton to support various forms of open. So it was originally created as part of a research project at Southampton known as the EdSpace project, and this was in support of our institutional e-learning strategy at the time. And the intention was to provide a single shared safe storage location for all sorts of educational resources. And this was after finding people were putting educational materials all over the place. So they were closed in the VLE, they were on personal web pages, on networks, on people's USB sticks, and the need to gather this in a centralized location so it could easily be discovered across the university. But the project was also about a degree of staff change and culture change and facilitating more sharing and collaboration across the university. Now, I should say this wasn't about creating an OER service for Southampton at the time, but given the timescales that we're talking about here, there was growing interest around open education and OERs specifically, and it certainly was the long-term hopes for that project that this, and aspirational, that this would become a project that wouldn't just release materials from the closed spaces such as the VLE, but they could transition to being available across the university and then openly to the world. So the output of that project was the University of Southampton EdShare instance, which I'll shorten to EdShare Sutton, which was launched in 2008. And following this, we saw an emergence of a number of EdShare platforms that were created to share OERs specifically. And many of those came about as part of the JISC UK OER programme that ran from 2009 to 2012. And that includes spaces such as Humbox, which was focused on humanities resources, Swapbox, which was social work and policy, and Language Box and Loro, and a couple of others as well. Now, with it being built on open source software, it's extremely extendable and flexible and adaptable, and that's what we do at Southampton. So we started to repurpose it for other uses as well. So we also created a version to sit behind our iTunes U store. So this was accepting submissions from across the university that were reviewed by our communications department. The content was being transcoded into the required formats and then fed through to the iTunes U front end. Our School of Medicine also created their own instance, and theirs was far more about secure access. So they needed to share content with their students, but it needed to be controlled and only available to a whitelisted set of individuals due to the sensitive content. And then we started to see a shift to the bigger scale institutional spaces coming on board. So one at Edge Hill, one at Glasgow Caledonian, and more recently at UCL and the University of Glasgow. But there were two key points in this timeline that were really influential that I wanted to highlight. So as with many research projects, and particularly ones that create software, if there's not the funds or people involved to sustain them in the long term, they tend to get left. So our enterprise team adopted the project code that was created as part of that EdSpace project, and we refactored it so that it could be made available as an enterprise offering for other people that wanted to create their own EdShares. And then further down the line, we did some major work on upgrading the core solution and creating an upgrade path for those existing platforms and ensuring that it was going to be more sustainable in the long term alongside our other products. So this is the community of EdShares that we have that's still available, and some, as I say, some of those recent additions. And across all of these platforms, they share a core set of features as part of being an EdShare, but it is extremely flexible. There's lots of different options, and it would take me all day to go through the wealth of possibilities that there are with the software. But as I say, this was focused on reproducing a Web 2.0 experience. So some of the features that are in there, there's an immediate lightweight deposit. There is no review process, just as you would find on any other social media sort of sharing sites. There's lots of different ways of tagging and organizing the content. There's inline previews of the materials, flexible editing permissions, and the ability to share editing rights with people as well as many other things. But that underlying software that sits beneath that is about open digital content. And what it does is that resources that you create on there, it will make the metadata open. So even if you've created educational materials that need to be closed, the metadata, the descriptions about them, about perhaps who created it, what it's about, the subjects it's associated with, who created it, and so on, are available openly on the web for harvesting and to be indexed by search engines. And what we've got here is quite a diverse community, both in terms of that functionality, but also motivations and reasons for having the platform. So we've got some where the focus is open, but also we've got others where it's a mix of closed and open, and that's fine. And just to look at a couple of examples a little bit more closely, this is Humbox, which was one of those JISC UK OER projects, and is very well known in the OER community. This involved multiple institutions and a distributed project team. And it's available openly for anyone to have an account and create resources on there. So, and when I was looking at the figures for this, about 99% of the content is open. And I think, to be honest, that 1% is probably a couple of test records that I've been creating in there. In terms of the specific features they've got the ability for people to provide feedback on the materials that are shared, to remix existing content, and the platform then maintains a relationship between those remixes, and provides lots of support around the creation of virtual groups and the ability for those groups to showcase the resources they create or are associated with. Another example is EdShare at GCU, so at Glasgow Caledonian. This is an institutional platform, and this is supporting multiple agendas. So this is supporting their institutional OER policy, but it's also hosting some legacy content from other systems that have been withdrawn from the university and there was no longer funding for. But it's also about taking the content from out of the VLE, where it was extremely expensive for them to host it with the VLE hosting solution. Now, only staff and students can actually log in to have an account to create items in EdShare at GCU, but obviously it's open for browsing and there's lots of open content on there. And there was lots of work that we did with GCU around the support and handling of video content. And with it being an institutional system, we've also got it linked in with lots of institutional feeds. So things like, we've got course feeds coming in, we've got close links with the VLE, and it's linked in with single sign-on. And we also do things like campus recognition or network and VPN recognition, so students don't have to sign in if they're on the institutional network. So I gathered together some figures across our community of those EdShares that are still accessible, because there are some that have disappeared, and those that have at least some open content. And you see I've grouped the institutional platforms at the top, followed by those subject-specific ones towards the bottom. But what you can see is there's a significant amount of resources that are being shared across our community of EdShares, and therefore their existence is already being exposed to the world. And amazingly, 55% of those are already open. And of course, this figure isn't fixed. So as I took these figures the other day, these figures are going to continue to grow, and hopefully as we see more EdShares come on board, it will grow even further. And I'm always saying to people, it's fine to have closed content. There is no one size fits all. Some content needs to be remain closed. For some people, it's a transition. If it's been in closed spaces, it can seem quite scary to suddenly put them in the open. But they're in a great place in an EdShare that from a technical perspective, it's extremely easy to make them open and available to anyone. But when you do have this mix of content, we do need to be thinking more about how discoverable the OERs are, specifically by that worldwide audience. Because if OERs cannot be discovered from a practical perspective, they may well be closed or not exist. And within each platform, we're already spending lots of time focusing on how we can organize and present the content and support the ways in which people are working, using things like course codes, descriptors, and as I say, linking with the VLE. But as I say, when it comes to OERs, we need to be thinking about reaching that global audience, making them accessible and discoverable to people who perhaps traditionally wouldn't be able to access higher educational content. Now, Google is obviously part of that story, but it's certainly not the end of it. And we wanted to make it possible for someone to come along and search and know that all the results that they're retrieving are open and available for reuse. And to this end, we've created the EdShare Hub. Now, this is a separate service that we are running on our servers, and it harvests that open metadata that exists across our community. And there you can carry out a federated search across the network and have that confidence and convenience that you're knowing that you're only discovering the open content. Now, how did we achieve this? Now, obviously, at the Computer Science School, we like to write code and we can create things extremely rapidly. And this was achieved through the rapid development of a plugin that we've called SyncIt, which was developed by my colleague, Justin Bradley, who's the lead for ePrints. Now, the SyncIt plugin gets installed on the EdShares themselves, and then we have the host service running centrally. Now, let's say we have an OER that gets created at EdShare at Glasgow. This sends a notification to the hub. And if it's recognized, so we recognize and accept requests coming from that service, a request will be sent back to the client for the metadata of that resource. That EdShare will then send it back in an XML format, and that metadata gets imported into the hub. And then at that point, it's available for searching. And exactly the same process would apply if you were modifying a record, so we can keep up to date with any updates that are happening to records all the time. Likewise, if we were deleting a resource, or for example, if a resource was open and it needs to be closed, a notification will get sent to the hub, confirms the ID and the action that it wants to take place. If it's accepted, it will be processed, and the record is deleted. It really is that simple. Now, I do get asked about the sustainability of solutions, our solution EdShare, and a service like the EdShare Hub. And yes, there are challenges, but there's also a number of strengths about the way that we run. So yes, there's no driver for OER, and we do find that that has an impact. And our work with EdShare is largely focused on champions in the sector, but also applying our own expertise and ideas as we move forward, and certainly as I'm picking up a number of things through the presentations and sessions that I'm attending at this conference. And I should say, when ePrints was first created, ePrints had those same challenges. While we were waiting for those kind of national drivers to come along with open access, we were always working with champions in the sector, and that's still true today. Now, we're not centrally funded at Southampton, so we can't ring-fence funding to dedicate to some of these community service layers. But our enterprise team now has been established within our university for over 15 years. We're not for profit, and we exist to sustain the software, which we do through the services we provide. And we're working with over 80 institutions directly to support them or host them, and ePrints itself is used, as I say, across the world. Now, I put this green box, it's sort of staggered between the two, because we exist, the purpose of our enterprise team is we exist to sustain the open source software, and we support those who are using it. Now, this can be a challenge to our sustainability, and I've seen this point come up on Twitter earlier today, because it depends ultimately on how open fits in the strategy of institutions and organizations across the sector, and those making the decisions. So, and we also do find that people's perceptions of open and even open source can be a challenge. So when we see large-scale commercial providers come along, we don't have the same multi-million-pound marketing budgets that perhaps they do. And in the procurement processes, when we sort of convey the costs for an open source solution such as ePrints or EdShare, we don't have the fee in there for a recurring license fee or anything like that to use the software. And you'd think that would be great because it is cheaper than the commercial providers. But actually, perceptions of open source from some people sometimes can be that it's a lower quality or perhaps it's too high risk. But this is a mature piece of open software. ePrints has now been around for almost, if not longer than 20 years. It's owned and managed by University Southampton. But this can also be a strength because we do work across sectors. We work across people that are working in the open access spaces, open education, and open data. And we also do find that there's lots of innovation coming from these spaces, and we can apply them and make them available to our community. So looking ahead, we are running user group meetings for EdShare. I just had the first one last week at the University of Glasgow, and we're hoping to run that on an annual basis with virtual meetups in between. We've also got an open Google group space for anyone that's interested in being part of the conversations, contributing ideas. We will be responding to feedback from some of the recently launched EdShares, and certainly locally at Southampton, we're following up with some of our champion users on how EdShares can support them in their day-to-day working as well as in the open. And just to highlight a couple of things that we have coming up for work ahead for us, is we've already got in progress that we're working on a preview service, and this is in response to Blackboard Ally. That you can when you upload content to EdShare, it gets transformed into different formats. Now, we've already been doing this for a very long time, but actually what we can do is return it in far more formats. If you upload a Word document, for it to go through our preview generation service, and it returns it to you in various formats. So we want to extend that further and ensure that it's providing it in accessible formats. And something I tweeted about yesterday off the back of one of the presentations towards the end of the day is exploring some integration with Synote. Now, Synote, again, was created at the University of Southampton and is for transcribing media content and providing collaborative editing around transcripts. So there's an awful lot of things, and again, I could talk all day about the sort of things that we want to be doing. But I think I've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. So we've got some questions again on the VVOCs about sort of how we can reuse them, so what the content on the licenses and whether people can embed the stuff on their own VLEs.
So in terms of the most common types of records, it depends on the platforms. Largely it is PowerPoints and Word documents, but for GCU, for example, they use theirs heavily for hosting their video content, so lecture captures and things. It really does vary across all the platforms. Yes, you can embed content in the VLE. We've specifically put a feature, again, this was developed through the GCU version, that you can embed. We focused heavily on the audio and video content. There's the embed feature, so exactly like you can do with YouTube, you grab the embed code and post it in your VLE. And all of the resources that we create have permanent URIs. So if you post them in your VLE, they will roll over to your next academic year and they won't have changed.
And for the content, is there a specific license? Are they all under Creative Commons licenses for reuse?
So the licenses is down to the person that's depositing the resource in question, but all the Creative Commons licenses are there, and we can even extend them if there's licenses on there that aren't there currently. And as Creative Commons updates, we keep them up to date as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any questions in here? So we have some more questions online. One that seems to be popular that's got some likes is whether EdShare can help with the duplication of resources across an institution.
We do actually have, on the ePrints, we have created a deduplication tool because this is an issue across our platforms when people are submitting records in support of open access and where we're getting feeds from publisher sources as well. There's duplicates coming through, so we do have a deduplication checker. Yes, and there are facilities that when you are creating resource, it does checks as you're entering it to see, well, has someone already entered something with the same title, to try and reduce that duplication. So yes, we do have tools in there.
And do you have any data about the extent to which your shared resources are used by other users, maybe across universities and things like that?
We do have a stats package that's added to all of our EdShares, and some of them advertise that dashboard and some of them don't. So, not specifically down to, I think, like school level and things like that, but we certainly do. I think I put on one of the slides the sort of hits from Google, and they're coming from a variety of sources. We sort of track who the referring sites are, so whether it's coming from the VLE, whether it's coming from external sites. So yes, each repository does have a stats dashboard, so you can get that data.
Brilliant, thank you. So if there are any more questions in here, otherwise we'll thank Kelly and all of our speakers from this session.
Thank you.
Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology.